Hi, I have something very important to share with you today. You know, there's some obvious things that are not good for us, such as smoking and alcohol and this type of things, but your connections around you are a matter of life and death, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, what is that brain plasticity? Well, it's our ability for our brains to change and adapt. See, repeated things that we do over and over, once our brain knows what is that behavior, your brain creates connections so that next time you repeat that behavior, it becomes easier. That's the reason why you can grab a ball, you can close your eyes, and throw that ball exactly where you want it. How can you do that? Because there are pathways, there are roads that form in your brain that allows you to do that. And that's the reason why we learn skills and we're able to do this very easy, such as play an instrument, do the work that you do every day, and as you do that many times, it becomes easier. And that has to do with the fact that our brain is in constant change. So, if our brain is in constant change, what is it that changes? Well, inside our brains, we have the brain cells called the neurons. And the neurons, if you see the graphic, you can see how there are little arms. So those arms connect with one another, and that is what creates those pathways. And brain change is needed for many things, from maturing to learning how to speak, to learning new skills. Even things like religious conversion is directly related to neuroplasticity. How can somebody that used to curse and be an alcoholic and a smoker today abhors alcohol and smoking? How can that change be so big? Neuroplasticity. So today, we're understanding that there are things that can have negative effect or positive effect on those connections in our brains. Like this fascinating study that happened not too long ago. In this study, what they did, they had mice that they put separate from one another. They were in a dark underground with no light. Imagine that, just the mice by themselves, each one of them on their own cage. And when they offered these mice addictive substances such as morphine and water, the mice that were in this horrible condition voluntarily started choosing the morphine as a way of getting out of that horrible reality that they were living. No social connections, no interactions. But the experiment went one step further. And in the next part of the experiment, they got those mice out of those cages and they put them outside in a setting that simulated country living. And in that type of setting, these mice were able to do exercise, form families and friends, and create those healthy social connections. Those previously addicted mice and rats that were addicted to these opioids, once they put them in this new setting, these animals actually voluntarily started choosing water instead of the morphine. Can we see where we're going into this? See, what we are putting around us, the influences that are around us, do have an impact on what type of things I choose. Now, you may be saying, well, doctor, but we are not rats, we are humans. Well, it's true that we are not animals, but still the same applies. See, there's some very interesting research that has been done following the people that were fighting the wars of Vietnam, those American soldiers that were sent there. Just think about it. Think that you are one of those soldiers. Here you are in a place you don't even want to be. You know, it was a lottery, so you got selected and you had to go even if you didn't want it to. Two, you are in a horrible situation. You are in a completely foreign place, and you are in constant fear and anxiety. You don't know when the next soldier is going to show up, the enemy soldier, and start shooting at you. You have, you don't even know where to step because even the ground, you know, they have these mines in the ground and so forth. The friends that you are making, the other soldiers, some of them, you saw how they got injured in front of your own eyes, how they got killed. I mean, it was a horrible environment to be in. And you know, many of those soldiers that were living that horrible reality started getting addicted not only to cigarettes but to many of the opioid substances that they had access to. But the war didn't last forever. And those that survived, as they were able to go back to the U.S., the environment again changed. Now, when they got home, they had friends, they had girlfriends, they had wives, they had loving families, many of them that were waiting for them to come back. And once the environment was changed, research show that 75% of them voluntarily gave up those opioid addiction as a result of being in a different environment. That's how powerful the environment that you put around you have regarding addictions. Now, another fascinating study that was done in Canada. If you see a map of Canada, you will see that most of the cities in Canada are located in the bottom of Canada. Now, if you zoom the map a little bit further, you will see that there's tiny little towns literally all over Canada. Who lives there in that harsh environment? Well, the native Canadians have lived there for thousands of years. They know how to survive that type of environment. But something has changed. As civilization from the West has come to those places, the way of living of these native Canadians have changed. And you know, it's sad to see that. I have the opportunity as I travel around the world to have seen this firsthand. And many of these native Canadians have broken, have destroyed the way they used to live in the old days. And you know, scientists started realizing that actually many of those communities of Native Canadians had between 500 to 800 more suicides than the rest of Canada. So they were shocked and they wanted to know what they can do to improve the health of those Canadians. And they realized that most of those suicides happen among young people. So they went and talked to young people to try to understand what was going on that was driving those very high suicidal rates. And this is what they found out. They found out that many of these young people didn't have much to do. They spent their hours by themselves in front of a television, and their choices reflected this. Their food consisted of mostly junk food and just sitting down in front of a television screen just to let the hours pass. But you know, The interesting thing that they found is that those areas had very high suicidal rates. But not all the areas had very high suicidal rates. Some actually had low suicidal rates among the young people that had stories to tell. When they asked them questions, they were passionate about living in those places. What made the difference between the first group and the second group? The second group lived in communities in which the elderlies took time to connect with the young people. They took time to teach them the customs of their ancestors, the language of their ancestors. And these young people felt proud to be part of those communities. Those communities didn't have those tremendously high suicidal rates. So that's why, as Johann Hart says, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And the reality is that the way we think has an impact in us. The Proverbs talks about this. He says, "For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he." So our thinking affects our actions. And as Dr. Ross says, the only thing that I know that truly heals people is unconditional love. We are made to love and to be loved. We are made to connect with others. What's the harshest punishment that you can ever give to a prisoner? Solitary confinement. If you remove somebody from their connections, is one of the worst punishments you can ever give to somebody. And that's why research is showing the following. People that are socially isolated are at increased risk for disease. No wonder why King David said, "A merry heart does good like a medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones." And study after study shows, for example, that people that have social isolation are at higher risk for disease, even if they're not smoking or they're trying to eat healthy and so forth. In fact, the New York Times recently ran an article, "Loneliness can be deadly for elders. What is the antidote? Friends are the antidote." And it's not the elders that are the problem. We're seeing a lot of middle-aged people being socially isolated. The biggest threat facing middle-aged men, it's not smoking or obesity, is loneliness, says this article in America. And the thing of it is that in the Western world, you find that pattern. Like this article that came out recently about Australians. Loneliness is contributing to depression among elderly Australians, but connections can be a lifesaver. This is such a humongous crisis in the Western world that in the United Kingdom, the government appointed a minister of loneliness, because there is so much loneliness, and that is affecting not only their mental health, but their physical health of these English people. In fact, a recent survey in 2016 found that 82.5% of Australians are feeling lonely. And the thing of it is that a Harvard study from 2010 said that being lonely is equivalent as smoking 15 cigarettes in a day. Is smoking good for you? No. So is loneliness good for you? Absolutely not. And this is the irony. Cities that have thousands and some of them millions of people, a lot of people are lonely today. In fact, here in New Zealand, in a recent survey, 52% of those New Zealand women over 75 were living alone. And being lonely, as I mentioned, is equivalent as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And that's why researchers say that social isolation has the same effect as being obese or being a smoker. In fact, it has been linked to increased blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, depression, anxiety, and more sadly, cognitive decline, risk of dementia and Alzheimer's. And that's why we know that lonely people have 64% increased probability of ending up with dementia. So that's why today we know that social isolation is a risk factor for disease. Like this creepy thing they invented in Japan. It is this hologram that you connect to your Wi-Fi, and they call it the robot girlfriend. And the creepy thing is sending you messages throughout the day. Oh, how I hope that you can come home so we can spend some time together. Spend time together with what? With this creepy thing. You don't need the robot girlfriend. What you need is a real human being that you can talk, that you can eat together, you can have some fun together. That's the way that we are made. Politico, another newspaper in America. Someone who lacks social relationships has the same risk of early death as someone who is severely obese. And sometimes if we are connected, but if our connections are not good, that's not good for our health. Somebody in unhappy marriages is at an increased risk for ending up with heart disease. And this applies both to males and females. Or this one, people that went through a heart procedure, if they were not married, or they were socially isolated, or they didn't have a close friend, 50% of them died within the next 5 years. Compared to those that had at least some social connections, only 17% of them died in the next 5 years. And then if you add social isolation to anger, it's even worse, both to males and to females. So we could spend the whole time showing you study after study after study after study showing how social isolation is not good for you. So what is that social isolation? Well, it is closing up and saying, this is personal. Nobody should ever know about this. This is private. Nobody should know about it. What we need is social intimacy, to be able to open up to a friend, to somebody that I care about, and show what's really in my heart. That's when healing really takes place in our lives. And you know, research is showing that the longest living people have a certain common denominator. Number one, they have a life purpose. They wake up in the morning, what the people in Okinawa call the ikigai, the reason why you wake up in the morning. And they have a purpose to serve and to make others happy. Another characteristics that they have connections between old people and young people. Hanging around with old people, if you're old, is good, but also connecting with young people, it's good also. The young people benefit from the wisdom of the elderly benefit from the energy and enthusiasm of the young people. And another characteristics, they have a healthy social network that they meet on a regular basis and they get encouragement. What the Okinawans call a moai, a group of friends that are with you in the good times and in the bad times. And another interesting characteristic that the longest living people on planet Earth have is that they have the spiritual factor. They like to worship together. They like to deal with their stress and anxiety by coming to God. Let me tell you this interesting story of social connections that I learned and success that I learned in Norway. Back in the 1990s, I actually moved to Norway. I actually speak Norwegian because I used to live in Norway. And as I moved to Norway, I realized that Norway was very different from Mexico, where I grew up. You know, Norway, very prosperous country, very clean, very honest, very modern. The levels of corruption are very low. And I had that question in my head: why do the Norwegians are such different society from the people in Latin America where I grew up? So what I did, I went to the local library to find books on the history of Norway. And as I'm reading the history of Norway in those books, I get shocked. It looks like if you were to close my eyes and give me that book and tell me, look, you're reading the history of Mexico, I would tell you, yes, this is the history of Mexico. It was the same dysfunctionality as in Latin America. Leaders were corrupt, there was abuse of power, there was a very much separation between very rich people and very poor people. There was abuse of that power that they had on the weak ones. It was a very dysfunctional society. But something changed in Norway that didn't change in Mexico. And that is the message of Martin Luther took a hold of the people, and that message of Protestantism created a transformation in their thinking, to the point that it was not only blah, 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 but they actually made changes in their behaviors, addictions, and so forth, and the whole country became Protestant country. And you know, I have more than 85 countries that I have visited around the world. And I can tell you, you show me the country that was touched by that Lutheranism, Protestantism type of philosophy, I'm going to show you the most prosperous countries on planet Earth. You have Canada and America, you have Iceland, you have the UK, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Holland, Switzerland, Germany. These are the countries, you know, that people risk their lives to move there and to get a second opportunity in their lives. And the influence also went to the other parts of the world, such as South Africa was a tremendously prosperous country, such as Australia and New Zealand. You just check your national anthem and you can see the influence of this philosophy. And then you find in Asia, you find Hong Kong, a colony from the UK, Singapore, a colony of the UK. If you have ever been to those places, tremendous prosperity in those places. And also you have Korea, South Korea, the country with the most Protestants in all of Asia. And Japan had some influence there after the Second World War as the Americans took over that country. So loneliness is not good for you. Now check this following shocking statistic from New Zealand. This is from a newspaper there. More than 650,000 Kiwis have felt lonely, says this newspaper. And those aged 15 to 24 are the loneliest. Now notice that range, 15 to 24. If you go to statistics and you see which people claim to have no religion, you find that bracket of 15 to 24, that age that has become very secular. And this is the shocking second fact. You show me the most secular countries on planet Earth, I'm going to show you the most suicide rates in the world. See, countries that are very secular or communistic type of thinking are the countries with the most suicides. Removing that spiritual factor from your life is not good for you. Just recently, I was speaking in New Zealand. Tiny little village. There was about 1,000 people in that village. As I'm running around, I like to run in the mornings, I counted 3 churches in that 1,000 population. Now, if there's 3 churches in a population of 1,000, it means that people used to be very spiritual. Sadly, 2 of those churches are actually closed today. People no longer go, and they had to close the doors in those churches. And by not participating of this type of church activities, that's having a negative effect on the mental and physical health of people, and is creating a lot of lonely people. That's why, like this publication, it says, actively religious people are happier. And notice this interesting article from a newspaper in England. The article is called, "I'm an Atheist Who Goes to Church. Here's Why You Should Too." And it talks about this story of this very secular English person that used to see the beautiful churches in England. And one day he said, I'm going to get enough courage to go and visit one of those churches. He went there and he loved it. You know, he loved the social connections, he loved the fellowship, he loved the potluck as he connected with people. He says, I'm still an atheist, but I love going to church. It's meeting an important need in me. Look at this study. What is most cost effective? Taking medication to lower cholesterol or attending church? Conclusion, this is the American Journal of Family Medicine, going to church is cheaper and more effective for your cholesterol. And that's why Albert Ellis, one of the most influential psychologists, in his younger days, he says, religious belief is equivalent to emotional disturbance. But you know, research is changing and showing that religious participation is actually good for you. And notice how Albert Ellis, the same person that says religious belief is equivalent to mental disturbance, he says today, I can safely say that the Judeo-Christian Bible is a self-help book that has probably enabled more people to make more extensive and intensive personalities and behavioral changes than all the professional therapists combined. So that's why Albert Ellis, even though an atheist himself, says people that have a belief in a loving God, actually that is psychologically healthy. So that is my challenge to you today. How are you going to connect with others? I suggest this could be a good option.